Iron legions conquered the ancient world. Unstoppable armies marched across 3 massive, bloody continents. Emperors demanded total domination over vast, foreign territories. Military engineers built magnificent roads that spanned the globe. Yet these fearsome, blood-soaked conquerors ultimately demanded their monthly payment in basic, evaporated seawater. Rome paid its killers in salt. Precious silver coins were frequently debased and heavily hoarded. Biological survival required constant, massive daily sodium intake instead. Imperial quartermasters distributed white crystals alongside heavy iron swords. When hyperinflation destroys metallic currency, empires must compensate their violent laborers with literal, edible survival. Let us unearth the bizarre ledgers of the Roman Salarium. The human engine demands biological fuel. Legionnaires marched 20 brutal miles every single day. They wore heavy iron armor under the scorching sun. Soldiers lose massive amounts of sodium through constant sweating. Without immediate replenishment, the human biological system totally collapses. A mighty conqueror will quickly die of hyponatremia long before meeting the enemy.
Faster, men! Move those timbers!
To project military power across a hot continent, the empire fundamentally had to master extreme biological hydration. Logistics strictly dictate all military conquests. You cannot feed a standing army on fresh meat. Ancient warfare lacked any form of artificial temperature control. Protein rots incredibly quickly during long summer military campaigns. Evaporated seawater acts as a highly effective chemical preservative. Tons of cured pork form the absolute dietary backbone of the marching infantrymen. Salt effectively allowed military quartermasters to pause biological decay, projecting caloric power across impossible physical distances. The imperial military scale was unprecedented. Rome maintained hundreds of thousands of active, heavily armed soldiers. This demographic anomaly required massive, continuous daily resource extraction. Supply lines stretched from the Scottish Highlands to the Syrian deserts. Administrators meticulously calculated the minimum sodium required per fighting man. The aggregate demand for dietary salt completely consumed the empire's vast domestic production capabilities. Maintaining a permanent standing army violently disrupted the natural, localized equilibrium of ancient agricultural commodity markets. The state rapidly monopolized coastal extraction. Private salt pans were systematically absorbed into strict imperial control. Bureaucrats viewed sodium production as a critical matter of national security. Coastal estuaries were aggressively engineered to maximize shallow evaporation pools. Inland brine springs were violently seized from newly conquered native tribes. The imperial war machine legally redefined a basic human necessity as exclusive state property. By establishing an absolute monopoly over biological survival, Rome engineered a perfect, inescapable system of economic leverage. Salt mining was an absolute death sentence. The physical extraction of rock salt required immense, expendable labor. The state condemned thousands of captured slaves to the dark mines. Toxic dust rapidly destroyed their lungs in suffocating, unventilated underground tunnels. Miners were intentionally worked to death to maximize daily production quotas. The glorious expansion of the civilized empire relied entirely upon this horrific human meat grinder. The pristine white crystals delivered to the heroic front lines were fundamentally paid for with enslaved blood. Extraction decimated the surrounding natural environment. Brine boiling required absolutely massive quantities of raw timber fuel. Entire forests were systematically clear-cut to feed the roaring industrial fires. The localized ecological devastation left vast regions entirely barren and desolate. Ash and toxic runoff poisoned the once fertile coastal agricultural waters. Generations of local agrarian communities watched helplessly as their ancestral lands were irreversibly destroyed forever. To feed the ravenous military machine, the state willingly orchestrated the complete ecological liquidation of its provinces. The Via Salaria is an economic artery. This ancient road connected the coastal salt pans to the capital. It was specifically constructed to facilitate massive bulk commodity transport. Heavy wooden carts deeply rutted the stone under immense, continuous weight. The highway represented the absolute logistical spine of the Roman state. Every single stone on that historic highway was laid to ensure the flow of white gold. Physical infrastructure in antiquity was rarely built for public convenience, but rather for ruthless military capital extraction. Armed escorts heavily militarized the highways. Salt shipments became incredibly lucrative targets for desperate, organized banditry. The state deployed elite cavalry units to ruthlessly protect the convoys. Checkpoints were violently enforced along every major imperial trade route.
Where did you acquire this silk, merchant?
Security costs began to vastly exceed the basic costs of production. The military essentially existed to protect the specific commodity required to feed the military itself. This bizarre, self-sustaining loop of armed protection illustrates how total war ultimately corrupts all civilian economic activity. Civilian markets were systematically bled completely dry. As legionary demands aggressively increased, domestic consumer supplies rapidly dwindled. Our quartermasters held the absolute legal authority to seize municipal stockpiles.
No, please,
merchants faced brutal executions for holding back their private inventory.
Beg you, by Jupiter, do not take
The
them.
free market was forcefully subjugated to endless imperial military requisitions. Urban populations suddenly found themselves unable to preserve their own winter food supplies against the rot. By redirecting essential biological commodities to the frontiers, the government essentially mandated quiet starvation across the provinces. Deficiency unleashed a silent, terrifying public plague. Without dietary sodium, child mortality rates spiked across the poorer districts. Livestock grew incredibly weak and failed to reproduce without salt licks. The poorest citizens scavenged desperate, toxic alternatives from the muddy coastlines. Physical lethargy and severe cognitive decline haunted the starving urban slums. The grand glory of the expanding empire was physically built upon the creeping decay of its citizens. Macroeconomic prioritization of military logistics always creates devastating, unseen microeconomic health crises within the most vulnerable populations. The state weaponized salt to crush rebellions. Restive provinces frequently relied heavily on imported sodium for basic survival. Emperors could instantly blockade trade routes to starve an entire uprising. Sieges specifically targeted the destruction of regional salt pans and warehouses. Submission was physically guaranteed when populations could no longer preserve meat. Depriving a culture of salt was infinitely more devastating and terrifying than deploying a dozen armed legions. The commodity warfare allows an empire to execute total demographic subjugation without ever spilling a single drop of blood. The salt tax funded the military machine. The infamous Vectigal Salinarum extracted immense financial wealth from the populace. Officials artificially inflated retail prices to generate massive, immediate government revenue. This deeply regressive tax disproportionately crushed the poorest agrarian laborers.
Salt tax will ruin us all.
Evading the salt tax became a highly organized, dangerous underground economy. Citizens were financially drained simply for purchasing the biological compound necessary to keep their own hearts beating. Taxing a basic biological necessity reveals the predatory nature of a state desperate to finance foreign conquests. Salt slowly transformed into a fungible fiat. Soldiers stationed in remote outposts could not eat their entire ration. They began trading their excess crystalline blocks with local border tribes. Barbarians deeply desired the pure, high-quality Roman sodium for meat preservation. military rations effectively became the most stable currency on the frontier. Legionnaires essentially functioned as heavily armed central bankers, injecting liquidity directly into previously primitive barter economies. When a state-issued commodity universally outpaces the utility of its coinage, it organically assumes the role of currency. The silver denarius faced a catastrophic collapse. Desperate emperors continually reduced the pure silver content of official coins. Inflation aggressively destroyed the purchasing power of the average Roman soldier, and legions openly threatened violent mutiny over their rapidly depreciating financial compensation. The state desperately needed a payment method immune to metallurgical debasement. A terrified emperor finally realized that while he could dilute silver, he could never artificially dilute salt. The transition from metallic currency to biological commodity perfectly illustrates a sovereign government attempting to outrun hyperinflation. The empire faced an absolute crisis. Runaway inflation completely shattered the imperial military budget overnight. Angry, unpaid legionnaires openly threatened to march on Rome. The emperor desperately needed a stable, universally accepted currency. Silver coins were entirely worthless when a soldier could not buy his daily rations. To prevent a catastrophic military coup, the state officially guaranteed compensation through vital, life-sustaining physical commodities. The Salarium was formally born. Administrators calculated a highly specific, guaranteed monthly salt allowance. This crystalline allocation bypassed the wildly fluctuating metallic economy. Soldiers received an asset with absolute, intrinsic biological value. A legionnaire could safely consume it, trade it, or use it to preserve his meat. By indexing military compensation directly to a biological necessity, Rome invented the first inflation-proof payroll system. Salt legally became a measured wage. The state issued heavy leather pouches to every soldier.
The keystone of
Quartermasters meticulously weighed the white dust on brass
the winds
scales.
of history.
Precise measurements ensured absolute loyalty across the sprawling empire. The promise of guaranteed physical survival effectively silenced the terrifying rumblings of military rebellion. This brilliant economic restructuring essentially transformed the marching imperial army into a vast, salt-backed financial institution. The allowance evolved back into coin. Carrying massive physical blocks of salt was incredibly inefficient. The military eventually began issuing specialized money strictly for salt. This stipend was explicitly designated as the Salarium Argentarium. The conceptual link between human labor and life-sustaining sodium was permanently and deeply forged. Even when paid in silver, the psychological contract explicitly promised the absolute guarantee of physical survival. The modern salary was officially cemented. The financial concept rapidly spread throughout the civilian administration. The bureaucrats and governors demanded their own guaranteed salarium payments. It became the universal standard for regular, scheduled compensation. The ancient military necessity organically evolved into the permanent backbone of structured human employment. This profound linguistic and economic shift proves that human compensation always originates from desperate physical necessity. Soldiers became the ultimate economic arbiters.
They're here.
The marching
Lower the
infantry
prices quickly.
effectively controlled regional
Five
inflation
only
and
five.
pricing.
Get out of the way.
Local merchants desperately sought the high-quality
I will not
imperial
take
salt
this.
rations.
My family needs
The
food.
military camps functioned
Have
as
mercy, I
massive,
beg you.
highly secure central banks. A Roman centurion possessed the financial power to completely disrupt a primitive provincial farming economy. The weaponization of this basic commodity fundamentally tethered the entire European economy directly to military expansion. The empire inevitably crumbled into dust. The mighty Roman infrastructure eventually collapsed under its own massive weight. Vast, sophisticated salt extraction networks fell into absolute, unrecoverable historical ruin. But the powerful linguistic artifact of the Salarium completely survived antiquity. We still blindly utilize this exact military terminology to negotiate our modern livelihoods. The enduring concept of the salary proves that ancient military logistics permanently rewired global human compensation. We all work for our salt. Modern employees receive direct digital deposits instead of heavy leather pouches. We trade our precious time for completely abstracted, digitized fiat currency. Yet the underlying psychological contract remains entirely identical to the Legionnaires. We demand guaranteed, structured payment to secure our basic biological survival. When a modern worker fails, they are literally deemed not worth their salt. This ubiquitous idiom brutally reminds us that human labor was once ruthlessly weighed against physical sustenance. Commodities will always anchor fiat illusions. Governments continuously manipulate the complex, invisible levers of modern macroeconomic policy.
We are ruined!
Paper money inevitably loses its purchasing power through relentless, quiet inflation.
Get back!
When abstract financial
Gone.
systems collapse,
We are doomed!
society instinctively searches for tangible value. The panicked hoarding of basic goods reveals our terrifying, deeply ingrained historical fragility. The Roman salt crisis demonstrates that sophisticated monetary theory cannot ever overrule the basic human stomach. The ledgers of Rome are closed. The marching legions are nothing but silent dust blowing across Europe. Their cruel conquests and magnificent engineering feats are buried beneath millennia. But every time you sign a formal modern corporate employment contract, you are unknowingly participating in a brilliant, desperate, ancient economic pivot. You are accepting the exact same survival terms offered to a starving infantryman. The ultimate price of imperial power
empty.
was permanently embedding military desperation into our daily economic vocabulary.